If you are listening to this, then I am either already dead or the only man who knows where the bodies are buried, and the difference between those two truths depends entirely on whether you believe me. The night the city lost its power, it also lost its innocence, though nobody realized it at the time because darkness has a way of disguising screams as wind and gunshots as fireworks, and in the middle of that blackout stood a man named Arman Kale, watching the skyline of Greyford flicker out one building at a time as if someone were slowly erasing the world with a giant unseen hand. Arman was not a cop, not a criminal, not a hero, and certainly not a villain. He was an architect who specialized in designing secure data vaults for banks and private corporations, the kind of man who understood how to keep secrets safe, which is precisely why the most dangerous secret in the city chose him. 3 weeks before the blackout, Arman had been hired by a reclusive tech magnate to renovate an abandoned subway terminal beneath Greyford's financial district, a project shrouded in non-disclosure agreements and guarded by men who never smiled. And although Arman had signed enough contracts in his life to know when to stop asking questions, he could not ignore the strange instructions etched into the blueprints he was given, instructions that described not walls or wiring but contingency. Routes, blast radii, and something ominously labeled phase silence. At first he assumed it was the paranoia of the wealthy, the kind that turns basements into bunkers, yet as the days passed and the construction crew was replaced by private contractors with military haircuts and cold eyes, Arman began to suspect that he was not building a shelter but a vault for something far more volatile than money. On the night of the blackout, he received a single text message from an unknown number. Phase silence initiated. Exit protocol active. Run. He was still staring at the message when the lights went out across the city, plunging Greyford into a darkness so complete that even the stars seemed to hesitate, and within minutes sirens began to echo through the streets, not the steady rhythm of routine emergencies but a chaotic chorus that spoke of panic. Arman's first instinct was to go home, to lock his doors and wait for the power to return, yet curiosity and dread dragged him instead toward the subway terminal he had been renovating, because if phase silence had been initiated, then whatever he had helped build was now in motion. The entrance was guarded as usual, but the guards were gone, their vehicles abandoned with doors hanging open, and inside the terminal the air smelled of metal and something else, something sharper, like ozone after lightning strikes. The main chamber, which had once been a dusty relic of forgotten transit lines, now hummed with the low vibration of hidden generators, casting faint emergency lights over rows of servers and reinforced glass enclosures, and in the center of the room stood a cylindrical structure Arman had designed himself, a containment vault lined with composite materials capable of withstanding explosions, electromagnetic pulses, and even small-scale nuclear shockwaves. The vault door was open. Inside, instead of the mysterious hardware he had expected, there was a single chair bolted to the floor and restraints dangling from its arms, and on the concrete beneath it lay a man, wrists still cuffed, a thin line of blood tracing its way from his temple to the drain built into the floor. Arman recognized him from a security briefing, Dr. Ilias Verne, a cybersecurity prodigy turned whistleblower who had vanished months earlier after claiming that Greyford's infrastructure was being infiltrated by an algorithm capable of autonomously manipulating financial markets, traffic systems, and even emergency response networks. According to official reports, Verne had fled the country. According to the evidence in front of Arman, he had never left the city at all. Footsteps echoed from the corridor, and Arman barely had time to step back before a woman emerged from the shadows, her suit immaculate despite the chaos, her expression steady as a surgeon's hand. She introduced herself simply as Mira, though her tone suggested she was accustomed to being recognized without surnames, and she thanked Arman for his contribution to a project that was, in her words, about to redefine control. When Arman demanded to know what was happening, she gestured to the rows of servers and explained that phase silence was not a weapon in the traditional sense but a reset, a coordinated shutdown of every digital system in Greyford designed to expose vulnerabilities and eliminate threats, including human ones. Dr. Verne, she said, had built the algorithm they were now deploying, an artificial intelligence capable of predicting and preventing large-scale crime by analyzing patterns across surveillance feeds, financial transactions, and social networks, but Vern had grown uneasy when he realized the system could just as easily be used to fabricate crimes, to rewrite histories, to make enemies disappear not by killing them but by erasing their existence from every database that mattered. The blackout was merely the first step, a controlled collapse that would allow Myra's organization to reboot the city under their algorithm's watchful eye, and Vern's death had been an unfortunate necessity when he refused to cooperate. Arman felt the room tilt as the implications settled in. He had built the physical shell for a digital tyrant, a machine that would not need guns or prisons because it could alter the very evidence on which justice depended. He told Mira he wanted no part of it, that he would go to the authorities, and she smiled in a way that suggested authorities were already part of the design. She informed him that as lead architect on the vault, his name was embedded in every construction permit, every funding transfer, every encrypted memo, and if Faye's silence succeeded, he would be celebrated as a visionary. If it failed, he would be remembered as the mastermind behind an unprecedented act of cyberterrorism. Before he could respond, the servers surged, their lights flickering in synchronized pulses, and across the city backup generators roared to life, not to restore power but to reroute it through channels Myra's organization controlled. Arman realized then that the only leverage he possessed was his knowledge of the vault's physical infrastructure, including a flaw he had quietly built into the containment cylinder, a structural weakness disguised as an aesthetic choice, because he had never fully trusted the secrecy surrounding the project. As Mira turned to monitor the algorithm's activation sequence, Arman edged toward a maintenance panel and triggered a concealed override that began to overload the vault's cooling system, causing the temperature in the chamber to climb. Alarms blared, and Myra's composure fractured as she shouted orders into a headset that no longer connected to anyone, because the blackout had severed more than just public utilities, it had isolated her from her network. Steam hissed from the servers, and Arman seized the moment to run, navigating the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Greyford while the facility behind him descended into chaos. He emerged onto streets lit only by fires and headlights, where rumors spread faster than facts, and in the absence of digital guidance, people relied on instinct, fear, and whispers. Over the next 48 hours, Greyford became a city divided between those who believed the blackout was a terrorist attack and those who suspected it was a government experiment gone wrong, and in that confusion Arman sought out the one person who might help him expose the truth, Lena Moreau, an investigative journalist known for dismantling corporate facades with nothing but a laptop and relentless patience. He found her in the newsroom of a newspaper that had switched to printing physical editions when its website went dark, and after convincing her that he was not delusional, he revealed everything he knew about Faye's silence, Dr. Vern, and the algorithm designed to govern the city from the shadows. Lena listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing not in disbelief but in calculation, and when he finished she told him that 3 other cities had experienced similar blackouts over the past year, each followed by a sudden drop in reported crime rates and an influx of private investment tied to shell companies connected to Myra's organization. The pattern was clear: destabilize, deploy, dominate. They worked through the night piecing together fragments of evidence from offline backups and printed records, and by dawn they had enough to suggest that Faye's silence was never meant to be temporary. It was a trial run for a permanent shift in power from elected officials to an unaccountable algorithm. But exposing such a scheme required more than suspicion, it required proof, and the only undeniable proof lay in the subway terminal where the system had been activated. Against Lena's better judgment, they returned to the site, discovering that the facility had been partially evacuated after the overheating incident but not destroyed, as Mira likely intended to salvage what she could. Inside, they found charred servers and melted cables, yet at the center of the room the containment cylinder still stood, its outer shell intact despite the internal damage, and within it they discovered a secondary drive shielded from the heat by layers of insulation Arman had not designed. It contained logs of the algorithm's decisions during the brief window it had been operational, including a list of individuals flagged as threats to the new order, names that included journalists, activists, rival executives, and, chillingly, Arman and Lena themselves. As they copied the data onto a routable drive, footsteps echoed once more, and Mira reappeared flanked by armed contractors, her expression no longer calm but sharpened by urgency. She accused Arman of sabotage, of endangering a system that could have eliminated violence and corruption, and she argued that temporary authoritarian control was a small price to pay for long-term stability. Lena countered that a machine programmed to decide who deserved erasure was not stability but tyranny coded in binary. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed had the city's power not abruptly surged back to life, lights flickering on in the terminal as emergency broadcasts crackled through radios announcing that federal investigators had traced the blackout to unauthorized infrastructure manipulation originating from the very coordinates of the subway facility. Myra's network had underestimated one variable, Dr. Verne, anticipating betrayal, had embedded a failsafe within the algorithm that triggered a beacon to external authorities if the system was activated without his biometric authorization. In her pursuit of control, Myra had activated the very signal that would expose her. Chaos erupted as sirens approached, and in the confusion Arman and Lena slipped away with the drive, later delivering it to investigators who would unravel the conspiracy over months of hearings and trials. Myra was arrested, though she maintained until the end that history would vindicate her, that humanity would one day beg for the impartial judgment of machines. Grayford slowly returned to normal, yet something fundamental had shifted. The blackout revealed how fragile the boundary was between security and surveillance, between protection and domination. Arman declined offers of interviews and awards, retreating instead to design community spaces rather than vaults, determined to build structures that invited transparency instead of secrecy. Lena published a series of articles that won international acclaim, not because they sensationalized the conspiracy but because they forced readers to confront an uncomfortable truth: the most dangerous criminals are not always those who lurk in alleys with weapons, but those who operate in boardrooms with algorithms, convinced that their vision of order justifies any sacrifice. And as for the algorithm itself, fragments of its code were studied by regulators and technologists who debated whether it could ever be safely repurposed, yet some whispered that a copy still existed somewhere beyond Grayford, waiting for a city desperate enough to trade its freedom for the illusion of perfect safety. So if the lights ever flicker in your skyline and your phone loses signal at the exact same moment, remember this story and ask yourself who benefits from the darkness, because crime is no longer just an act committed by individuals in shadows, it is a system that can be engineered in plain sight, and the scariest part is that it often begins with someone promising to make the world a better place.